Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. We have two guests today. Joining us is Jorge Heine, a public policy fellow with the Wilson Center's Latin American program and a former ambassador from Chile to the People's Republic of China. Also, a fellow with both the Latin American program and the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States. Benjamin Creutzfeldt joins us. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Good to have you here.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Our topic today is China's involvement in Latin America. We'll decide among the group here whether that's rising, falling, peaking, and where it stands. But let me begin with even a more general question about how aggressive has China been in its entree into Latin America, and how does this fit into their Belt and Road Initiative? Jorge, can we?
Sure, of course. Well, I'm not sure aggressive is the right term. I would say assertive, which is very much the foreign policy style that President Xi Jinping has followed, and in marked contrast to the approach of his predecessors, that their motto was keep a low profile, and this is very different. And this has also happened in Latin America. President Xi has visited on a number of occasions. In fact, he will be visiting Chile, believe it or not, for a fourth time at the end of this year. A second presidential visit. Previous to that, he went as vice president and when he was a party leader. You look at the numbers, and it's remarkable. Trade between China and Latin America has gone up from $10 billion in 2000 to $307 billion last year. I mean, if that is not exponential growth,
yes,
what is? So this is very much. It's the economics that is driving the relationship between China and Latin America. And people refer to something called the China boom, which was 10 years from 2003 to 2013, where China was particularly present in the region, and growth in the region in that period was very high.
Mm-hmm. Benjamin, your thoughts on this assertiveness versus aggressiveness? I think that's words matter, right?
That's right.
Words matter, and the choice of words is very important. I think. I mean, what I feel is important to maybe to counterbalance that image is while China has grown exponentially in trade with Latin America, as it has with pretty much every region in the world, and that has worried some and is worrying the United States right now. In terms of investment, although that has also grown, there have also been moments of stagnation. And in comparative terms, China is nowhere near what many European countries and the United States are in Latin America in terms of assets held and companies owned in the region. So that also tempers a little this extreme worry that we see right now. So in other words, in Latin America, China is present. China is owning things, but it isn't yet anything even near what, say, Mexico and Brazil own in smaller countries in the region. So
can you quantify that for us as far as what is the gap as far as China playing catch up to these other?
I can give individual examples, like in terms of foreign stock in Peru, for example. China, last time I looked, was at number 15 in foreign countries investing in Peru. It's big in the mining sector. It owns 30% of foreign held mining assets, but it is not as big as many make out.
How much of a factor are China's lack of sort of cultural or historic ties to the region?
Well, I would say there are two things. Obviously, China is very far away from Latin America, and it belongs to a very different culture. So that creates barriers that are quite obvious, related to language and outlook and traditions and so on. That said, this is changing, and there are Confucius Institute throughout the region. Learning Chinese is becoming a priority among a number of young people around. They realize that the action today is in Asia, so there is change. But obviously, there's still a long way to go.
Does China have much of a soft power footprint in the region?
It's trying to grow that, but what's particularly interesting is not so much the programmatic approach in terms of the Confucius Institutes, which are, of course, may help, but China itself has realized that it's way behind in its understanding of Latin America, and so they have, over the last 3-4 years, opened as many as 60 study centers at universities across China for the study of Latin America, as well as other regional regions in the world. So that is promising, because we can certainly not deny that mutual understanding is key, and so that's something that is being driven inside China. So there we have a possibility that individual companies, that future leaders, whether it be in corporations in the diplomatic service, will maybe have a more nuanced understanding. So although the regions, China and Latin America, will never be physically closer because it's one of those things, but there will be
continental drift takes time.
Takes time, but there will be possibilities of understanding each other better, and that can help.
What about this notion of concern? Is it possible to generalize? Do countries generally see China's growing assertiveness as a positive thing or a negative thing?
Well, I would say the following. It is important to understand that for 2 centuries, for all of our independent history, we looked basically at the United States and Western Europe as the international trading and diplomatic partners. Suddenly, in the course of the past 20 years, there is a third player in that game, and that is China. So it's important to understand that is a good thing. By and large, you want to diversify your partners. You want to have more rather than few of them, So the notion that this somehow should be a threat is not something either governments or political parties or other players buy. They see it's an opportunity. It's one more. And obviously there is no Chinese monopoly or anything that approaches that, as Benjamin quite rightly said. But by and large, it's better to diversify your trading investment partners than not to do so.
Is it a zero-sum game? As China rises, do European influence and U.S. influence automatically retreat, or is there enough to go around?
That's a point of view. I mean, basically, many people seem to believe that, and this is something that the current administration of the United States has increasingly portrayed it as such. And there's maybe quite a genuine feeling that every step China takes means the U.S. has to retreat a little, and this is. I don't see it that way. Evidently, Ambassador Heine doesn't either. It's and now we see quite a diversity of leaders in the region. Certainly, President Bolsonaro of Brazil quite vehemently, at least would like to push back against China. Has said, China is not buying in Brazil, but buying Brazil. That was one of his great campaign comments. And then he realizes that indeed they need a strong buyer of goods, and so. This is something that where personal preferences may be conflict with commercial realities, and this Colombia has traditionally been very close to the United States. And what is important maybe to realize is not just that countries like Chile, which has really led in terms of developing its economic growth around China, I think, quite heavily. But Peru has managed to balance very well, distributing its exports to different regions, between different regions in the world. That's something very positive. But there is still the question of how much the U.S. can benefit from sort of treading softly or pushing back or warning. I feel, for example, part of the difficulty that Venezuela is currently facing and the seeming impossibility of resolving this crisis is not so much that Russia to a degree and China are somehow supporting the regime, but that the current United States leadership is not a sufficiently attractive aspirational alternative to many of those countries. So it's much harder to choose one over the other.
What are China's ambitions in that geopolitical realm? Obviously, they have economic interests, but in the Venezuela crisis that you bring up, Benjamin, we've heard a lot more from the U.S. and Russia than we've heard from China.
Yes. Well, China is very prudent. It's hedging its bets, and that is what Chinese diplomacy is very good at. But I would like to underscore the following. Often there is this view that somehow China's presence in Latin America has a strong ideological component, and that it somehow would back governments of a certain stripe as opposed to others. My experience, I spent 3.5 years in Beijing, that is not the case at all. China wants to do business. It engages governments from the right, from the center, and from the left. As it happened, it provided quite a bit of credit to a number of countries that were closed off from the international credit markets. We're talking about Venezuela, we're talking about Ecuador, we're talking about Argentina. But that was done because China was the land of last resort. It was not because it had some sort of preference for those governments. So Chinese diplomacy is very pragmatic, and they will deal with governments of all sorts. And I would say that that is also very much the case in many, not all, but many countries in Latin America. In case of my own country, we alternated between center-left coalition and center-right coalitions. And we had a center-left coalition until March of last year. We now have a center-right coalition. President Piñera, who is a conservative leader, he was just in Beijing for the second Belt and Road Summit, and was the one Latin American leader present there, signed 14 agreements, and has a very good relationship with President Xi Jinping, much as President Bachelet had before. So again, this pragmatism on the Chinese side is also being mirrored, I would argue, on the Latin American side. It doesn't have to do with ideology. It has to do with state-to-state relations.
And this pragmatism you describe, is this an automatic advantage over countries that may engage on a more ideological level?
I think it is. I mean,
as far as doing business.
Yes, of course.
Bottom line.
I mean, the point is, states don't have permanent friends or permanent enemies. They have permanent interests, And as long as our diplomacy is driven in that way, we will do better.
The current trade dispute between the United States and China, what are the implications in Latin America?
Well, what started off as, and is still primarily a trade dispute or trade war, I think one can widely accept that that's what it is.
People are warming up to the term war. Initially, we were being a little cautious in that regard.
Very true.
We talk about trade spat.
Yeah.
It's more than a spat now, yes. The stakes have been raised. So to the extent that is just trade, I think there are some countries in Latin America that can benefit from spillover or alternate sources for certain goods that the Chinese will more comfortably buy. Like Brazil and Argentina specifically, but there are others that are caught, and more I think have been caught in the wider fallout of this dispute, which is that it's being portrayed as an ideological and values, even a question of who supports which global order, and that is where it's very difficult for smaller countries, most countries in the Latin American region, to they feel in a corner of having to take sides. I think that's
right.
Something that
yes, but it also has impacted the region in different ways. For example, my own country, Chile, that does a lot of trade with China, has been impacted quite negatively because we export a lot of copper. Chile is the main producer and export of copper in the world. China is the main importer of copper. And what do they do with the copper? Among other things, they put it into electronics that they ship to the United States. So if that goes down, the price of copper goes down, and we are left in the lurch. Whereas Brazil and Argentina, who export soy that is largely consumed in China, are not affected by it. So my own view is that trade wars are bad, and they are bad for everybody.
And we don't know where the end is in sight on this one. The gentleman on that big picture of the trend lines, where are we headed? I know we've had a little bit of discussion off the air via email and also in anticipation of this discussion about whether or not China's influence is peaking, whether it's still on the march or growing, or whether it's in decline. What are your relative thoughts on this?
Let me give you my take for whatever it is worth. There is one view that we have reached sort of peak China, and that from now on things will stay more or less as they are, or even go down a little bit. This is on the basis of some financial flows and other such assessments, and also because of the trade war. My own view is that is not going to be the case at all. Why? In Latin America, we have a problem. Growth last year was 2.2%. This is the lowest growth of any region around the world. This is half of Africa's growth, sub-Saharan Africa, to give you an idea. So we must do something. We must recover that impetus. Now, where is that going to come from? Half of the world's product now comes from Asia, and an important part of that from China. So if we want to give another impetus to our growth, well, we must link up with the countries and with the region where there is growth. Europe is not growing. We don't have much to sell to Africa. So what are we going to do? So China has a lot to offer. And my own view is that we're going to see a lot more of that.
I will add a dimension to that. I mean, I actually fundamentally have the same view and think that it's something that we'll see more of. And there have been some elements may level off for a couple of years. And of course, if you look at individual countries, there can be quite some difference depending on the political preferences and what not so much national interests are, but as I often emphasize, elite interests within certain countries. And they're not always the same as what sort of the broad population would desire. But what I think is important, what will rise as we expect China's footprint in the region to rise, is also China's involvement in conflicts that are, and I don't mean armed conflicts, I mean simply, Latin America has some of the countries with the largest inequality, and it has huge exposure, especially Central America, to environmental changes with climate change. And those are things that I think China is not currently well enough prepared. Maybe nobody's well enough prepared, but even the Chinese are not well enough prepared to face up to and to sort of engage fully. And that's something that then will open up to more criticism, and that's something they have to sort of learn to deal with. And that's if you read any reports on ex-mining conflict in anywhere that the Chinese are involved in. Previously, those were Canadian companies. Now they're Chinese companies. So they have to kind of learn to talk more openly with the local interest groups, with civil society on all fronts. And that's something I think that's risky and is a trend that we will see.
Speaking of trends, as we look ahead, you talk about China and the United States. Often part of the discussion is aging populations and what implications that will have for the economy moving forward. What about the nations of Latin America demographically? How do they measure up in that comparison?
Well, it varies very much from country to country. The general rule also holds for the region. The more developed the country, the lower the demographic growth is. So the countries of the southern cone, Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, have quite low demographic growth, whereas say countries in Central America, situation is very different. We see it in Chile. We are getting a lot of immigrants. There are 100,000 Haitians in Chile, believe it or not. There are 200,000 Venezuelans. I think that's a good thing. We're a country of immigrants. We need more able-bodied people, and so it's welcome. So there's quite a sort of shifting populations around the region.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much. The kind of intellect and insight and knowledge that you bring to the table is what makes the Wilson Center a special place. And I bring this up because both of you are ending the conclusion of your current terms here.
That's right.
So I want to ask you before you leave, what are your plans moving forward? Benjamin, what are you going to be doing after you leave the Wilson Center?
Well,
heading back to the university?
Not right away, but I will be teaching in the beginning of next year. I'll be teaching on semester at sea on U.S.-China relations, which is an exciting time to be teaching that.
Yes.
There are many, many opportunities out there waiting. I'm looking what to do next.
Well, and once you're a member of the team, you're a member of the team moving forward. Right. So, how about you, Jorge?
Well, I've got 3 books that I still have in the pipeline. One here with my project here, 2 more. I will also be teaching in China. So I'll keep busy.
Great. And I see a book launch in our future. I hope you'll be back when that happens.
Right. Of course.
Gentlemen, thanks very much. Okay. Thanks to you for watching as well. Hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now and that you'll join us again soon for a future edition. Thanks again.